So has everybody got it? I'm gonna go ahead and start. You got it? Did you find the advertisement? So if you type in on your search engine on your phone, Open Democracy, Dennis Childs together, it'll bring you to an article that's an interview with me by, I think the author's name is Mark or Tom Carlin or something. You click on that article when you find it. It has the word capitalism in the title. And then scroll all the way down. There's like 3 images. The third image is of an auction advertisement. It should say public sale.
Yeah. These are like the advertisements in the Legacy Museum.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this one that I found in the archive. So I guess I'll go ahead and start. Welcome everyone. My name is Dennis Childs. I was raised in San Diego, Denver, Colorado, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood District, where Black Wall Street happened. And I, my high school years were in San Diego, California. And I went to a high school that, as of today, has about probably 35, 40 languages spoken at it. I appreciated the presentation earlier. You okay?
Yours.
Oh yeah. If you could pass it out, man. I appreciated the presentation earlier today that talked about the need to think not only domestically but transnationally, to think about migrant communities, to think about the, what Dr. King would call the indivisibility of our struggles, that he practiced and talked about along with Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and others, a concept of the indivisibility of justice, what he called it, which meant that the idea that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I firmly believe that. I live in San Diego, Tijuana, which is a place where all of these different sectors of the struggle converge into one geography. The wall that separates TJ and San Diego is an apartheid wall, just like the apartheid walls that are in Palestine, that are paid for by our tax dollars. And so my high school was one that reflected that dynamism of our struggles and interconnectedness, to use George Galvisa's words from earlier. And so not only the convergence in our conditions, which are very obvious, the median income, the last time I checked in my neighborhood in San Diego for a family is around $28,000 a year. Can someone shut that door back there, please? How do you make it in California as a family on $28,000 a year right now?
You don't.
You don't. That's the answer. You're not. And then my co-panelist, the councilwoman yesterday, she said something very important, which was, you're not supposed to make it. I'm not a touchy-feely person, and it's surprising in some ways that I'm in the position that I am, because in my introduction and my bio, I also have to say what pays the bills, which is I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego. But people that went to my high school, which is Hoover High School, named after the president that illustriously brought the United States into depression, Herbert Hoover. Come on in.
No, we're looking for participatory defense.
Okay, I won't take offense.
Oh, no.
It's participatory, so it's all good, yeah. What was I saying?
Hoover.
Yeah, Hoover, illustriously named after the president that brought the United States into the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover. Not J. Edgar Hoover, which would have been appropriate for the actions of the police in that neighborhood. So East San Diego, where I'm from, like I said, around 40 languages spoken in my high school. So people coming from all over their motherland, all quarters of Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America. I mean, it is an incredible place, but it's also the place, my high school, where we had a man that, you know, tried to make himself look like the main character in Hawaii Five-0, who was a kind of a member of the sheriff's department and a security guard at our school that rolled around calling himself Kojak in police cars all day, jacking my friends and myself. And he literally referred to himself as Kojak, and he had a strap in public walking around school every day. Okay, so I know that kind of probably squares with a lot of our own experiences wherever we may come from in terms of the domestic terrorism that happens against our communities. And so a lot of what I have to offer is going to be not so kind of organized, because I'm just going to free flow a bit, will be about changing the narrative, which has been something that we keep talking about. So crime and criminality, you know, that kind of ideology that has been implanted in anyone who happens to watch what Sonia Sanchez, I think she's a beautiful person, she's still alive, she was a member of the Black Arts Movement, a poet. And she, when referring to, I watched her over at Marcus Books over here in Oakland. I hope Marcus Books is still there over on MLK. I used to live right around the corner. I lived here in the town for 8 years. I remember her calling, she said, yeah, you know, I try to get kids in my circle to stop watching the idiot box. She was referring to what used to be called the TV. Well, now people all walk around with idiot boxes in their pockets and pocketbooks. And she said, you know, stop watching that. You know, Public Enemy called it Channel Zero. Stop watching Channel Zero. And anybody that has been, because talk about education and miseducation, what is more of a powerful miseducation device than the idiot boxes that we have? And one of the things in terms of those words, crime and criminality, those idiot boxes, the many that we have trained people to think, especially non-impacted people, is to dehumanize our community, to think of the individual people that commit what are called crimes as other than, you know. And luckily in my classes I have formerly incarcerated students now that check people when they come with that garbage. But it's not surprising when people spew out that garbage. And what I try to do in my work is center histories of slavery, chattel slavery, settler colonialism, and what Saidiya Hartman calls their afterlives into our current life. Leonard Peltier, Comrade Leonard Peltier, who's on lockdown, been on lockdown for over 30 years, current political prisoner, POW, from the American Indian movement, talks about, you know, my imprisonment didn't start when I got jacked for this supposed killing of 2 FBI agents. You know, my imprisonment started at birth as a person, an indigenous person. And Malcolm X said something very similar. He was talking about trying to get people to come into the movement. And he said, you know, well, some people are worried about getting arrested or whatever. And he said, well, don't worry about going to jail. If you're black, you were born in jail. And stop talking about the South. If you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. And I truly believe that. Those are the teachings that ground my work. And one of the things that does in centering these histories of genocide, because it's not just indigenous genocide that Peltier's talking about, and of course dating that back to 1492 with the original encroachment, genocidal maniac encroachment of that, what George Galvez was talking about earlier, that system, that shitstem, as Peter Tosh would call it, of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism. But you know, we use the date 1619 as well. And I want to say that chattel slavery is genocide. You know, we have to, if we want to talk about interconnectedness, because you know, some people will use body counts as a measure. Well, you know, chattel slavery, the Middle Passage component of chattel slavery, you know, historians argue about how many people of our people perished on the slave ships, which were the original prisons of the prison industrial complex. And the number that some people say is 60,000 in just the Middle Passage. Some people say 4 million. I don't care. If it was one going through that hell, that's genocide for me. And the other part is, what about the Africans who survived the transatlantic prison voyage and the saltwater slavery that they went through? And you know, the ones that didn't become what Emery Baraka describes as a part of the trail of bones that lined the bottom of the Atlantic, our ancestors who risked it all and said, I'm going to claim myself And the only way I have left right now, because you know there wasn't an opportunity like the Amistad when the 40 some odd Africans took the arms and killed the slave traffickers and took over the ship. When those opportunities weren't there, which is a kind of important methodology we could talk about later, you know, armed resistance is an important category that doesn't often get talked about enough. But then, okay, if that's not available, then I'm just going to jump off and be eaten by the sharks that were following the ships all the way across the Atlantic, because the sharks were very smart.
They knew they was going to get fed.
They knew they were going to be fed if they followed those wooden prison ships. Okay, so you know, then there's the other kinds of death that chattel slavery represented, because it wasn't just biological death; it was living death. And let's start with naming. What is, Brother Jesse? What's your name? What's your last name?
Burleson.
Okay.
Burleson.
My last name is Childs. What's your last name, brother?
LaFleur.
Huh?
LaFleur.
LaFleur. You could be French, I guess, you know? But most of us who are African descent, who haven't done the conscious thing of changing our names, our surnames. Brother James, what's your last name?
I don't know.
And that's where the X came from Malcolm X. That not knowing, if you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, the very beginning of it, he says, well, first of all, he was Frederick Bailey first. He wasn't even Frederick Douglass. But he wasn't Frederick Bailey first, because what James said is true. Bailey was another white person who was either his master or his overseer. And then Douglass, well, I don't even remember where he said he got that name from, but he definitely didn't have like a gene project or DNA thing to go figure out where in West Africa he came from. So the annihilation, the cultural annihilation that Africans went through as a main part of the system of control and domination and terrorism, so as to try to break human beings down systematically, to divide people according to different languages, so you couldn't even speak to your fellow captive, that divide and conquer ritual. So names, spiritual practices, language, histories, connection to family. The biggest legal kidnapping regime in history, legalized kidnapping on the most massive scale ever, that has never really been fully dealt with by this racist, white supremacist, colonial, racial capitalist, misogynist society. And now they want to say that they're tired of hearing about it, critical race theory and all this shit. And the reason why they keep saying that is because they know how powerful this changing the narrative that all of us are none and our other organizations are leading, they know how powerful we are. Because at first the slave ships didn't have rivets through which to put the chains on the bottom of them. I know many of you have seen the diagrams of the slave ships. The one that most of us see is of a slave ship called the Brooks out of Liverpool, England. And the system that that's actually a blueprint made by an architect. I was talking about it last night with some brothers, and I was like, you know, because architects now win prizes and get a lot of money, 6-figure and 7-figure salaries for designing prisons and jails and spaces of torture. You heard about the psychiatrists that were taking part in the torture rituals at Guantanamo Bay and other black sites in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's so much so that the associations for the psychiatrists and psychologists have tried to come out and make statements. You know what, you probably shouldn't be taking part in torture of prisoners who've not even had the chance to sit in court and say their defense. You know, where are those black sites? You can type that in. What is a black site? If you don't know already, you know, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, those processes have not stopped, run by the CIA. But the point here is that that cultural obliteration, the design of that slave ship was that there were so many rebellions on the slave ships that they had to change the design and put different things so that they could chain people down on the bottom to stop those rebellions. I ask my students all the time, who freed the slaves in the United States? You know, and if you're taking an AP history exam in this, you know, United Snakes, as some would say, if you're taking an AP history exam in this country, to get, because you know, at my high school, there weren't a lot of AP classes, advanced placement classes, and you know, I took literature, and you know, I did okay, whatever, took that exam and actually passed it somehow. I didn't read anything that the teacher was assigning because they weren't assigning anything that was relevant to my life. I didn't take the AP history exam because the word itself tells you why. His story. I don't want to hear his story anymore. I want to hear our story. I want to hear her story. And you know, so when you take that his story exam in the United States, what they ask you, like a question like who freed the slaves. Now, if you wanted to get the answer correct, you would circle a certain white man's name, an average racist white man's name, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln freed exactly 0 slaves in 1863 when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So, why? Because the place that he said he was freeing slaves from was at war with him and his government. And there was nobody, they weren't listening to that edict. It wasn't just Texas. You hear about Juneteenth and folks down there hearing about the Emancipation Proclamation late. Well, it didn't matter if you heard about the Emancipation Proclamation if you were in Georgia in 1863. You were still enslaved. Well, the Africans said, okay, well, we're not going to wait. We're going to just leave the plantation once they heard about it. And you know about General Harriet Tubman and all her works, freeing 800 slaves in one campaign of the Civil War at the Combahee River in South Carolina. Okay, I didn't hear about that in school though. We got to hunt this information down. When Harriet Tubman's name was spoken, they said, "Oh, Underground Railroad." I thought that shit was a subway, you know, because they didn't really teach anything that was relevant to our lives. But Abraham Lincoln is the answer if you want to get it right. But the real answer is there were over 200,000 Africans, because also in 1863, Abraham Lincoln finally got it through his head after being lectured by Frederick Douglass and other freedom fighters over and over again. Let us fight for ourselves. Why did he change his mind and let black people fight in 1863? Does anybody know?
They were getting their ass whooped.
They were getting their ass beat. Thank you, sir. The North was getting its ass beat in that conflict 2 years in. They were losing. We could be, well, most of us, I don't know what the fuck would have happened historically if he didn't finally make that decision. But he didn't make that decision because he felt like it. Before he was president, he was a lawyer in Illinois. And I told you I'm going to meander a little bit. He was a lawyer in Illinois representing white men who owned black people in the state of Illinois under a system that was called apprenticeship. Have you heard of that? Mm-hmm. Okay, then y'all are doing your studies. But you didn't hear that in a place called a damn school in the United States. So this is weaponry, this information. You know, some of y'all are incredible activists. I think of myself as just kind of, you know, support at the level of analysis. And it's not that the two things are separate. They always go together. You know, it takes all of us, or none. Todos or nadie. And I really feel that. But this analysis, I think, is hugely important. You know, so 200 to 250,000 Africans joined the conflict. And you know what? They had the most to gain and the least to lose. And guess what happened? You know what happened. We're here in what's called the United Snakes. So who freed the slaves? Because what the generals in the field said after the campaign and what Abraham Lincoln, the average racist, himself said.
We freed ourselves.
Boom. If it weren't for those,
it was popping off between them two, and we saw what side would be advantageous to us, and they were losing. We jumped in the fight and finished it.
But we have a high school in Southeast San Diego right now, the historical black neighborhood of San Diego, called not Harriet Tubman High School, Abraham Lincoln High School, Lincoln. So this is the mental warfare piece that we have to be very cognizant of. Did you have something in the back?
No.
Yeah.
I was just,
Well, you're a fellow San Diego.
I was right there with you.
Yeah, yeah. You know what I'm talking about. Tell me your name again, brother. Roberto. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. The same goes in places like Valle Logan, Chula Vista, all the poor, black, brown, indigenous, and also, like I said, people from all over the world, migrant communities. Not only do they subject us to conditions of poverty and dispossession and lack of access, etc., but they also lie to us and exclude this information that is really, really important. But I'm rambling and I want to get to some other things. I sent you to a place on the internet. There's an advertisement that I wanted you to look at real quick. Because I've been tasked by the organization to talk a little bit about my work, to give you just an idea where it has been and where it's going. And this advertisement that I found in my research and in the congressional record, this advertisement had not been published in any book since the meeting at Congress where a white abolitionist senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner went to Congress for the second time saying that the exception clause in the 13th Amendment was a problem. The first time he went to Congress and said it, they said there were only white people in Congress, and they all said to him, Charles Sumner, get over it. It doesn't matter that there's an exception clause in the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that was supposed to free 4 million black people. Big deal. Don't trip, basically. Then, over a year later, he opens up the Annapolis Gazette newspaper that you're looking at a piece of right now from, what is it called, the ads section?
Classified?
What's that?
The classified?
The classifieds, thank you. Classified sections of the Annapolis Gazette. And for hundreds of years, if you looked at classified sections in United States newspapers, you would see us being sold as the main thing being sold in the classifieds. Human beings being sold as breathing commodities. So there's nothing really exceptional about this advertisement except for the date. Except for the date. It's December of 1866, almost 2 years after black people had freed themselves, ourselves. How can you have a slave auction after slavery's over? Okay, who was the auctioneer? Can you see it at the bottom?
Sure.
The sheriff. The county sheriff did this. Okay, what did Richard Harris do? I got the dockets from Annapolis, Maryland, of his arrest. In the archive of the Maryland Antiquarian Society. I went into the crates to find what Richard Harris did that was so heinous that he would be sold as a slave on the courthouse steps of Annapolis, Maryland. He stole, in quotes, 1.5 bushels of wheat. And I think that is a real important symbol of the connections between chattel incarceration and penal prison incarceration now. And that is people's subjection to patterns of poverty, class war, racism, misogyny, colonialism are then, so the predictable outcomes of those patterns of violence against our communities, predictable outcomes like having to take food when there is none, and that there being no food is a part and parcel of your existence. I mean, my grandfather taught me about that as a sharecropper. My grandfather was in cotton fields when he was 6 years old in Arkansas. I mean, he gave my son a bowl of cotton that he grew in his house in Denver just to tell him, look, remember where you come from. Don't be ashamed of that. His dad had to give up 60% of his farm yield to some dude called a landlord at the end of every year. What is that if not a return of slavery? This is in the 1940s that this was happening. My great-grandfather would then go into the barn that the white man held the stuff that he stole from him and steal it back. But that's another tale to be told. But the fact that Richard Harris is being criminalized for living the predictable outcome of systematic poverty and oppression and white supremacist capitalism, I think really is representative of what we all are dealing with in our communities in living out the predictable outcomes of those similar patterns as they still affect our communities. And then, so what is crime and who is the criminal? is the question. Assata Shakur, in her autobiography, says, in a recorded piece that she gave before she was liberated by Sekou Odinga and others from the Black Liberation Army, she says, in To My People, this recorded message she gave in her autobiography, which, by the way, especially you young folks, if you haven't read Assata Shakur's autobiography, then you need to rectify that immediately. You've listened to her godson, I'm sure, if you're a young person, being Tupac Shakur. But you got to read his godmother's words. We celebrate her, but let's read her. You also got to read his stepdad's words, Mutulu Shakur. And in to My People, she says, you call us criminals and you murdered millions of indigenous people. You murdered little Bobby Hutton. You murdered Fred Hampton. You murdered all of these people in my community. Zaid Shakur gets murdered next to her. She gets shot at the beginning of her autobiography and drug across the pavement. And they left her for dead. They called people to put toe tags on her. The ambulance, when it came to the New Jersey Turnpike, wasn't even treating her and said, go ahead and bring out the dead man's kit. When she wouldn't die, they took her to the hospital and the police took turns aiming guns at her as she sat on what they hoped to be her deathbed. When she got pregnant on the inside with her baby Kakuya, the doctor came in and told her, well, you probably shouldn't worry, you know, your baby's not going to live anyway. If you see something in the toilet when you go to the bathroom, that's your baby. When she fought through that and all the neglect and non-prenatal care that she got in Caged, they shackled her to her bed during child labor, which is something that, of course, is still haunting its way into women's realities right now that are incarcerated. It was spoken about last night. So the connections are much broader than the category of labor. So what she says is, how can you call us criminals when you're doing that to us every day? That's called a hoodwink. That's called, like, you know, straight up, you know, con game. You know, and what Edward Said, the great Palestinian theorist, says is it's a system of blaming the victim. That is not to say that our people aren't doing some crazy shit. But the crazy shit is predictable when they're living the craziest shit, which is living under a structure of racial capitalism and colonialism. So the people that are running that structure, I just heard about the guy that owns Amazon. He's floating down a river in I'm not making this shit up, maybe you heard about it, in Holland. They got a lot of water there, I guess. Floating down a river on a $500 million boat that he owns. He comes up to a bridge that's too low hanging for his $500 million boat that's not even his main house that he has. How does anybody have $500 million to begin with? And then for him to have enough for that to be chump change for him. The bridge is hanging too low. Do y'all hear about this shit?
Yeah, I did.
And he pays the city to dismantle this hundreds of year old bridge so his fucking yacht can pass through. And then my students, I told them about it, and some of them didn't believe it, and they went and found it. They're like, but he paid them to put it back together again. I said, haven't you ever read Humpty Dumpty? Oxfam did a report years ago and found that the world's 8 wealthiest human beings control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the global population of the earth, which then equaled 3.6 billion people. 8 people. So capitalism, or the system, or what Peter Tosh, the mighty whaler, would call the shitstem of capitalism, or what Cedric Robinson calls rightly racial capitalism and settler colonialism, isn't that the crime? How do you blame the poorest people in society living under conditions of virulent white supremacist violence and terrorism for living out what you planned for us to do? And then making money off that process through the prison industrial complex of criminalizing us for those predictable behaviors like Richard Harris's that you saw in that ad that got him sold as a slave by the county sheriff. Because guess what? Not only did the county sheriff make money in that transaction, the county clerk made money in that transaction, the people that were the modern day slave patrollers who became the police who arrested him made money in that transaction. And then what about what he did as a prisoner when he got locked up? There was a system throughout the southern United States where white men could go to the courts and you got fined for taking that 1.5 bushels of wheat or stealing a pig, and could pay the fine that they knew very well that you could not pay, and buy you like an auction at the courthouse and bring you to their plantation or their coal mine and work you to death. And that system was called criminal surety, S-U-R-E-T-Y. Okay. Then there was the convict lease system, which was a bigger operation of that, where instead of going to the individual courthouse or the individual judge to buy us at auction, they would buy us at the level of the Congress and make deals. Sometimes it was governors who were the owners of what were called the penitentiary systems of states like Georgia. Former Confederate generals became owners, like in Louisiana, that space called Angola that we were talking about yesterday, where right now, as we are sitting here, black men and other oppressed peoples, criminalized peoples, are at work in the same plantation fields that our ancestors have been working in since the 19th century. That's happening right now. But don't have to go to Angola. Go right here to the prisons right here, because y'all tell me, you know more than I do, those of you who were formerly incarcerated. I only did one night at a time in my life, so I can't claim it. I made a joke about it. I got out with the dudes that were on lock with me that one time I was in jail in the county in San Diego, and they were like, what do y'all want to do? You want to go get a drink? I was like, I can't, but we made a joke about it. If we went to the bar and trying to talk to a lady or something, you know, in my case, I'm married, so I couldn't really do that, but you say, hey, you know, I just got out of the county. She'd be like, well, how much time did you do? 12. Wow, 12 years. No, 12 hours. So I'm not the expert. I'm not the expert. You know, Jesse, how much time did you do?
31 years.
31 years? You know, I mean, that's expertise on this subject matter. And, you know, what I said the other night was, or last night, you know, the people that I follow in terms of, you talked about in your testimony, I think, you know, going through something like George Jackson talked about in your testimony about ABC, which is like not only the labor piece, but also the degradation and violence of being shackled, of being treated and made, you know, like you're subhuman, and what that represents, and that connection to what the ancestors went through over time. And I think that, you know, I mean, I don't know how much time I have left, probably like 15 minutes.
I think anybody gonna interrupt you.
Yeah, so the patterns that we're talking about to get back to the topic of blaming the victim, you know, and switching, according to what Assata Shakur said, the narrative about who the criminal is and who the victim is. And it's not simple, of course. Again, individual responsibility is always there, but as Malcolm X once said, you can't stick a knife 12 inches into a person's back and pull it back 6 and call it progress.
Yes.
So there's danger in claiming the connections between the past and the present. What happened to Richard Harris as an exemplum of what happens to all the Richard Harrises and all the Assata Shakurs. And you know, the thing about things like the shoe, how many people experience the shoe? Security housing unit. You know, in 1983 in Marion, Illinois, the Illinois State Prison, they put the whole prison on lock. And the warden, when he did that, he said on record that the reason that he put the whole prison on lock was because of the revolutionary tendencies of the prisoners in Marion at the time. There was a fear of the power of the movement as it was appearing on the inside. So what they call Marionization is, oh wow, okay, our prisons are backfiring on us to the extent that, like Luis Vato Talamantes, I think of, and you know, San Quentin, member of the San Quentin Six, what he talks about is Comrade George and him and others were like building a movement where everybody talk about being in a sweat lodge and not seeing color. The only color that they saw was the color that the guards were wearing at one point versus the colors that they had to wear. That's what happened with Attica as well. So the level of repression that our communities have endured under the prison industrial complex, which started in 1492 to 1619 again, the level of oppression, it's like those, when they started installing those rivets at the bottom of the slave ship, they are afraid of our power. I know for a fact that I was not the most intelligent of my friends at Hoover High School. The most intelligent of my friends at Hoover High School were the ones that dude I told you about, Kojak, that rolled around with that Magnum strap to his hip, hemmed down every day and attacked viciously and took to juvie, CYA, onto that track all the way to places like Skeleton Bay. I know that for a fact because I've been quoting Malcolm X over and over again. Before Malcolm X was Malcolm X, who was he?
Richard Little.
Malcolm Little. But before that, who was he? Detroit Red.
That's right.
Detroit Red. Mumia Abu-Jamal, who now sits in what year of his political imprisonment? 30 some odd years. He's written 12 books in that time. He also wrote the blurb on the back of my book, which I'm very proud of. But he talks about seeing people like a young man that he was locked up with, who got locked up at 15 on an adult charge in Pennsylvania. And what he says in that section, it's like he calls it a friendly game of baseball and live from death row. What he says about, and he calls him Rabini because he doesn't want to reveal his name. He says, this child got locked up with me at 15 years old, and I'm seeing a new pattern setting in here. Because my point is that when they attack the movement, the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, the American Indian Movement, white radical organizations, the Red Guard, the Asian American wing of those radical formations, they were attacking also the communities that were supporting those movements. The state saw that the communities themselves were producing radical politics trying to socially transform the United States. So a part of the reason for the uptick in imprisonment would be, you got this handout from the New African Prisoners Organization of a document called We Still Charge Genocide, which is based on a petition that the Civil Rights Congress put out to the United Nations in 1951 called We Charge Genocide, charging the United States with the crime of genocide against people of African descent. So what the administrators of these concentration camp plantations saw was that even though they were using the prisons as a main mechanism of warfare, domestic warfare, that it was backfiring in the sense that people were coming together and reading stuff like Malcolm X and stuff like, doing a counter education to the miseducation that they got. So their theory was, let's turn all the prisons into the Marion lockdown. And the worst of the worst will be put in the shoe. Well, what does that mean? I mean, some people were put in the shoe in California. I found out about this when the 30,000 prisoner hunger strike was going on, for having George Jackson's book in their cell. I heard of one prisoner that got 30 years solitary for having George Jackson's Soledad book. Another prisoner got multiple decades for having an Aztec calendar on his wall. And what this means to me is the worst of the worst are really truly that. They're the worst in terms of the threat that they represent to the status quo, to these structures that we've been talking about, the would-be warriors. Malcolm X was able to read a whole prison library that was donated by some wealthy man in Massachusetts when he was on lockdown. He read every single word that was in those books when he was on lock. What happens when Bill Clinton comes along and gets rid of Pell Grants and gets rid of associate's degree programs in prisons? Also, when I was teaching at the San Quentin associate's program, not letting prisoners read certain books. They know very well who the most dangerous people in society are, but what they've tried to do is make the Detroit Reds of today stay Detroit Reds instead of becoming El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. to try to keep the Assata Shakurs to stay Joanne Chesimard, which was her, what she called, slave name. So the power that our communities have is represented on those that are targeted and violated the most. The low-hanging fruit, in other words, that you know, George Clinton in Parliament had an album called America Eats Its Young. It's a picture of the Statue of Liberty on the front of it with the Statue of Liberty with blood coming down her cheeks. Well, what is the prison industrial complex other than a process of consuming our youth? They knew very well what they were talking about. And demonizing our children and making TV shows that glorify in the terrorizing of our communities. But NAPO, that NAPO document that you have, we still charge genocide because there's the differences between, I'll end on this. There's also the distinctions between the original prison industrial complex of the plantation system and reservation system and today's. One of the main distinctions is that there was a time right after the Civil War, right after black people won our own freedom, where our labor was still fundamentally necessary for the economy to function. Most black people were still living in the South. What did they do? Criminalize black life. You've heard of driving while black? It was BWB, breathing while black. Not because of our skin tone or anything about us, but because they needed that labor. They thought of it as like lost free labor from their standpoint. Oh, well, we'll use the exception clause, except as punishment for a crime. We'll use that as a convenient way. You see the advertisement. Well, this was on a massive scale. They industrialized what was called the New South through neo-slave labor, our neo-slave labor. And there's slavery by another name. There's all the work that Angela Davis has done on this, the convict lease system. Companies were using it. U.S. Steel had prison slavery camps. So it wasn't just a Southern phenomenon, okay? So then they switched from, well, you don't kill your slave if you bought your slave at auction for, you know, the equivalent of $50,000 in 1850. You try to keep them barely alive so they can keep making you the commodities to make the economy go. That's not life from the perspective of the African involved, by the way, to be a breathing commodity. So don't get it twisted. But then after that, if you're a guard at a convict lease camp, you didn't put no money out on that captive. You didn't put any private investment. In fact, any investment was from the public taxes. So the theory went from barely keep them alive to keep them working for you to what was called one dies, get another. Working us to death because that we were already valueless as spiritual, in a spiritual sense, but then economically, there was no private investment, so it became genocidal. 10 to 60% of Africans who were incarcerated in the original convict lease system from 1865 to 1963 died within 1 year of their imprisonment.
How many?
10 to 60% per annum, per year. This is why even in the United States, they abolished that system temporarily, because it didn't really get abolished. I was giving a talk I was giving the keynote at Black Grad at Cal State Northridge, and I said, not only is everybody who's sitting here at the graduation, I don't want to rain on your parade. I know we're all going to listen to Stevie Wonder together and party or whatever after the ceremony, but every stick of furniture that the California State University has for its students, faculty, staff is made by prison slave labor, by law. Every single piece of furniture, by contract. So, and then I said, by the way, you could be making a call to order something on, you know, from a company like Victoria's Secret, and the person on the other end of the phone could be a loved one incarcerated. And this woman came up to me after the thing, sister, and she said, I can't believe you said that. I said, what? The thing about Victoria's Secret. I said, what do you mean? She said, I called the other day to order something, and when the person was supposed to take my information, my personal information, he said, you don't have to tell me your name or your address. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, why? And he said, because I'm your brother. And he was answering from inside a fucking prison plantation here in Cali. And people say, well, what are the odds? The odds are really high for young black men, and black men in particular, and people of color, women of color, and poor people. Because if 70% of the 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States are people of color, and almost half are black, 99.999% would only be able to swab the deck on Bezos's $500 million yacht, which means in poverty. Okay, so one dies, get another took over. All right, then people like William Patterson, who wrote the initial petition in 1951, started to notice something around the 50s. A lot of automation on the plants, like in Detroit, and the whole former steel belt that's now called the Rust Belt for a reason. They call it deindustrialization is what I'm talking about. That's a sugar-coated euphemism word for systematically displacing people who were uprising as communities for labor rights. You had the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. You had, I was talking about custodial staff in Los Angeles at UCLA were making more per capita than anybody could ever make in that kind of service industry right now, and were unionized. What did they do? Let's ship our factories abroad under what's called free trade, like the Maquila system down in Tijuana. We can pay slave wages there, no unions, no power on we can kill the workers with all the horrible conditions that they're in and all the toxins that are going right by their houses when they're living right next to the factory. What happens in the vacuum, like South Los Angeles? Watch the movie Bastards of the Party, if you haven't already. Bastards of the Party, which means Bastards of the Black Panther Party, made by a former gang member in Los Angeles named Clee Sloan. What you learn in that documentary, he says, I want to figure out where the beef between the Bloods and the Crips came from in Los Angeles. He ended up figuring out that it was an economic problem. That what happened is that where their fathers were working on places like the Firestone rubber plant in South Los Angeles, or other factories that were there, and buying, if you've been to South Los Angeles, South Central and those areas, there's these houses that black folks were able to buy, brown folks, through these kind of jobs. When they still had light rail in Los Angeles and all those things. He said when those jobs left, at the same time the drugs were flown in to get us addicted to that, and then addicted to the profits of slang and all this stuff, in the vacuum left by living wage jobs was what was the easy situation to criminalize us for living the predictable outcomes of that systematic exclusion from a living wage. A blue-collar job used to be able to get you somewhere. So the point is that from one dies to gets another, which still depended on our labor. There was a time when, according to William Patterson, our labor became superfluous. Not going to let you into the techie kind of Google economy. We're not going to let you in, we're going to make sure we keep you excluded from the things that'll get you out of that kind of working class type job, but then we'll make it so there are no working class jobs that pay a living wage, and then blame you for trying to survive in that situation. So that's, for me, what's called genocide. In other words, the solution for the existence of millions of people for whom there is no way to make an existence that is livable, the final solution for that was what we call the prison industrial complex. So, in other words, you can kill somebody by more than one means. And what people like Assata, George Jackson, and some people who I've learned from in this room, one of whom just walked in this room, is that we can be breathing and still dead. When you're in the bottom of a slave ship, you're in a situation of living death. That doesn't mean that you are completely dead, because we got a lot of revolutionaries that did some amazing things from within those conditions. There's still fear of that person because they can't completely kill us. But at the same time, I think that this kind of analysis, the danger of it, you can see it in the news now. Critical race theory, blah, blah, what is this? It's racist. That blaming the victim, even at the level of our analysis, because they know how dangerous this kind of analysis is. And I have to say again that I learned it from the comrades on the inside, from people like Sophia Bukhari, who, with the Jericho movement, from people like Dorsey, from people like, Linda Evans, and, the names go on and on and on, who Joy James calls imprisoned intellectuals. Because the abolition movement, if slavery didn't end, neither has the abolition movement to free our people from these conditions. And Fannie Lou Hamer said it best. I saw it on the back of one of our comrades' t-shirts here today. Fannie Lou Hamer at a women's convention in the 1970s said this, and I think this is another way of saying the name of our organization, the Bertolt Brecht poem, All of Us or None. She said, nobody's free until everybody's free. Nobody is free until everybody is free. And that is the idea that I started with, the indivisibility of justice. And there is no way that we can rest until we follow what Fannie Lou Hamer was saying when she said that. Nobody is free until everybody's free. And just because somebody like, a former president of the United States can have, I had somebody in San Diego say, you're going to be our San Diego Barack Obama. I said, well, you haven't listened. Because you know what? Because at the time that he was president, we had one supposedly black man in the White House, and we had nearly a million black men in the big house, as Ruthie Gilmore used to say. So when that's going on, when that's happening, that so-called black man in the White House is actually what they call a quisling of empire, a servant of the masters. The people who paid for his campaign are the ones that dictate his policies, just like right now. In the United States, when they were asked how many Iraqis they killed in Iraq, do you know what the answer was? We don't count. We don't count. But all of a sudden now, with this current war, all of a sudden you can't look at the newspaper without seeing all kinds of accountings of these victims of war. But our lives, the people of the third world, former colonized countries, are not valuable enough to make the front page or any page in the newspaper. And that's why this organization is so important, because we will not stop accounting for our loved ones. And we're not going to hold our breath and wait for some kind of Superman like Abraham Lincoln when we know that he was just an average racist. I forgot to tell you, when he was a lawyer, remember I said he was representing white men who owned as apprentices black people in the state of Illinois under the system that was called apprenticeship. The same state that until 1865 had a law in its books that as a free black person or an enslaved black person, you literally could not exist in the state. You could not come across its borders under what were called the black laws. These were Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, all of these like clean, innocent northern states, because we're supposed to be in this bifurcation of the bad white supremacist South and the good North. No, the black laws said that black existence was criminal. So these legacies we continue to endure, but All of Us or None is following that creed from Fannie Lou Hamer. None of us is free until all of us are free. Thank you very much.
He ain't crept around his hammer, but for what though? Hard to be inspired when your environment is cutthroat. Threw us in the fire, but we survived, and it's up though. Before we smell flowers, yeah, we knew the smell of gun smoke. Grandma used to say, the darker you is, the harder life. It always made me shed a tear, cause grandma dark as night. They taught us self-hate, and now she's scarred for life. Concrete jungle, we can barely see the stars at night. Throughout distractions, now they acting like we can't see. Let us off them plantations, but we ain't free. They say it's hard to see the picture when you in the frame. I'll make this bitch come to life, watch how you paint me.